It always is with the Tories. You have to at least give them that. They're great for Shakespearean type dramas.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chatter, a podcast from The Gist. Today we're talking to Stephanie Farnsworth from Stand Up Magazine. We got her to talk about independent and mainstream media, the media revolution that's going on in the country at the minute, as well as how she consumes her media and just her journalistic practices as well that she tries to ensure at Stand Up Magazine. If you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can sign up to our mailing list, and if you like the show, you can share us across social media. So let's get on with it. Here's the show. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's lovely to be on.
Well, it's nice to have you here. I may have had a bit of trouble getting you on, but we finally got there.
Hopefully, me and stand-up will be worth the wait.
Yes. So do you want to just sort of give us a little overview of what Stand Up Mag is and how you established it, why you thought it was necessary? Just give us the Stand Up Mag story.
Yeah, of course. Well, Stand Up Magazine, it was really, the concept was started actually the day after Trump's election, where all MA students doing our MA, our Masters in Magazine Journalism, and everything with Trump it seems so ludicrous, and young voices are being drowned out with Trump and Brexit, that we really want to make a platform to promote young voices and particularly young marginalised voices. And we thought, well, we're journalists, but how can we really do this effectively? So we got together in February and started to put together this magazine, and the print magazine launched issue 1 back in June, and now we're working on issue 2, which is going to be a digital release. So we have come quite far, and we've built up a really great audience, because I think the last election showed that young people do want to engage, they do want to have these discussions around politics. It's just that actually all the generations maybe haven't been listening that much.
Well, I think you can probably say that again. Actually, talking of young people in politics, I'm not sure if you saw yesterday, but the Conservatives are not endorsing, but the Adam Smith Institute, the neoliberal think tank, put out what they think is the millennial manifesto that the Conservatives need to adopt, and it included things like legalizing ecstasy and cocaine and reducing flight duties for under 30s so that they could go to Ibiza cheaper. And it just made me laugh, because I don't honestly know if they just don't get it. Like, I would honestly love to sit one of them down, like the Conservatives or even just the Adam Smith Institute, and just question them and be like, do you not get it? And I wanted to ask you, actually, do you think it's a case of that they genuinely just don't understand what young people want? Or do you think it's a case of willfully ignoring it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think genuinely that there's a lot of people in Parliament who think of young people as a bit like aliens. They don't really talk to us, don't really listen to us, they don't really have any clue what is going on. So then you get these reports which are a bit daft. I mean, yes, we do want better drugs policies whatsoever, but stop treating us as though we all just want to go out every single night and get high. There's a difference. When they do approach conversations, it seems to be very stereotypical and quite limited, whereas we want really nuanced debate and to be heard. But it also has suited them quite well, because Britain does have an ageing population. You're going to pick up the most votes by appealing to older voters rather than younger voters. So particularly for the Conservatives as well, they have always been the party for older voters. So I do think that there is ignorance, and I do think that it has not suited them up until now to listen to us. But because of the election and how close Jeremy Corbyn got, now everyone's thinking, oh my God, we actually have to stop paying attention to young people. But they don't actually have any idea how to do this and to talk to us just as though we're human beings.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of kind of just misunderstanding generally, but They seem to be doing it repeatedly. I don't know. After the election result, not long after actually, when there was a lot of Conservatives sort of freaking out about how much of an impact social media and digital media made, and they seem to be missing the fundamental point that social media was the vehicle, not the reason.
Yep.
For Corbyn's success. It was very, very useful in helping to get, messages out about policies, about rallies, about volunteering, about registering to vote. And the Conservatives didn't really take advantage of any of those. And again, do you think it's a case of just misunderstanding, or do you think, again, they just think that if they have a superficial social media campaign and they're like active online, that will draw people in?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they just don't understand any of it. I think that was apparent throughout the campaign as well. Theresa May would go to constituencies and it was very structured and very formal, and there was no real engagement. They don't seem to understand to be able to listen to people's real concerns, and then also to translate that into a good PR campaign to get people inspired. The reason why Corbyn's platform worked, although it has to be said that he did still lose the election, so there is, concern about whether with his Brexit position it will be sustained. However, Jeremy Corbyn latched on to this idea of hope, and he made it their election all about anti-austerity, which people are sick of, particularly young people who've had things lost like EMA or saying tuition fees risen, and there's struggles with affordable housing. He had a really great platform of hope, and then that's how the social media campaign worked. It wouldn't have worked if they had a terrible message. Theresa May offered fox hunting. That's not going to go well to sell well anywhere, whether it's on Twitter or in conversations. So, she was, and the Conservatives generally were very weak on all fronts in trying to engage just on a basic level at rallies, when meeting constituents, in the debate, and also their PR campaign, because they never actually worked out what message they were selling. They said strong and stable so much that actually it became a pitfall, because every U-turn they had, that slogan was just used against them. So it just looked like absolute rubbish.
Yeah, it really is. But to what extent do you think that our media was to blame for Corbyn's, not loss, but he was starting from such a position of weakness that it became about, when the election started, it became about consolidating what they had. Like, it was, hang on, maybe we can pick up a few seats here and there, but we really need to just try and focus on the safe seats, essentially, to make sure that this isn't a wipeout. And as the campaign went on, and the media was forced to be more impartial because of election rules, that then, his message actually got out there. Or, do you think that it's kind of, Corbyn is unelectable as a prime minister? Where do you think it's the real truth lies there?
I think he's definitely electable, and I do think that the media have a lot to answer for. And you can tell that by the way that it's being spun. Corbyn still came second. There is still a pretty big gap between who the largest parties in terms of seats. And yet Corbyn very much was spun as the winner. Now, the only way that happened was because expectations were so low in the first place. And that should never have been the case. If journalists were listening, not to what Corbyn was saying, but speaking with real people and real voters and their concerns, they should have been able to say, actually, this election is going to be about getting the Tories out and about standing up to austerity. And the media focused on the wrong things. They focused on Brexit, they focused on Labour's internal battles, but that's not what voters were focused on. And because of that, the media's kind of had to reset itself and look at the landscape and try and work out what's going on, because they've missed the whole story the entire time. I do think Corbyn is electable, and if anything, overcoming that negativity from the media has given him more of a boost, because he can say now, I've had everything thrown at me from the Conservatives, from the media. Here I am, a man of principle, and can go forward. Now, he has to be able to deliver that in terms of policies, and we have a very crucial time coming up with the Brexit negotiations, so a lot depends on that, and if Labour can unite and stay united. But he is right now looking like the most likely person to be Prime Minister whenever the next election is called. And the way things are, we don't know if that'll be in a few years or in a few months.
Well, it could very well be 2022, unfortunately. But we never know what's going to happen these days, so it's hard to really put a date on it, other than just expecting it to be 2022 and hoping we can push for it sooner if you're anti-Tory, I guess. But sort of on the media there, you obviously are involved with working with a lot of master's students of journalism. Is there anything that you personally highlight in the coverage that the media portrays, like as a whole, that you would point out to your students are bad journalistic practices? Or do you think, there's the mainstream media aren't as bad as they're made out to be?
I think there's a little bit of both. I think there's a bit of hyperbole around whenever there's accusations of bias, they tend to be blown up a little bit more than is true. But I do think that mainstream media has stopped asking the important questions, and kind of that's why it missed what was going on with this election. Didn't speak to voters that much, charity workers, campaigners on the ground. It focused more on the personalities of Corbyn versus the structure and the slogans of May. And actually it needs to get out of the Westminster bubble and start looking at all the other things going around and try and work out the story, because I do think they've got a little bit of tunnel vision and they got in that Westminster bubble and they didn't really question anything beyond that. And that's what surprised them. As much as a shock for the media, it was for Parliament, arguably.
Yeah, I really do think they kind of missed the trick. But my trouble with when people just spout about how the mainstream media are dead or you shouldn't believe a single thing you read in the papers is that almost every single paper, I say almost every single paper has are still doing some fantastic reporting. Like, people are very, very, very anti the Telegraph, or the Tory graph as it's known. But then their investigative department revealed a lot of the corruption in FIFA, and they're the ones that got Sam Allardyce fired from the England football manager's job because of the work they were doing. So I always find it difficult to hear people shout about how the mainstream media is dead as well, because there was some reporting done, well, not reporting, but there was some analysis done, and we'll put it in the description there, that mainstream media news brands still reach 97% of people. So regardless of the poor reporting maybe they're doing, or the kind of outrage headlines and whatnot, that they are still the media force in Britain, unfortunately, and that they still have such a huge impact on our political conversation that it's very hard to just completely write them off because of the size of the institutions. And I honestly wanted to see, since you're part of now sort of new alternative media, whether you see the mainstream media going completely down the toilet, for lack of better words, just fading away into nothingness. Do you see them maybe reassessing their standards and trying to be more impartial, trying to provide better coverage? Or do you think that that's impossible with the corporate ownership that we have of most of our major papers?
I do think the corporate ownership is a bit of a barrier, because when you've got one person in particular in control of so many publications, then the story kind of gets repeated. And what we're seeing now with online is that actually people want diverse content. They want to read different opinions. They want to hear different stories. And that is where the mainstream model, in my opinion, is failing. It's not reacting quick enough to that. It's not diversifying enough. And it's not speaking to issues that matter enough. Now, the mainstream media, I don't think is going to die whatsoever. But I do think there is going to be a restructuring, and there has to be, if it wants to be as healthy as it can possibly be. The Guardian does some amazing journalism, but is struggling for finances, and we know that. And they're not the only ones, because the cost of print and advertising isn't what it was. And right now the mainstream media seems to be struggling of how do we still get in views and make money from it without going to completely clickbait models, but also how can we get content that satisfies people. And I'm not sure that the mainstream media has managed to do that in the way that new startup sites are, because new startup sites have no expectations whatsoever. They can go out there, get the stories, and all of a sudden people will look and they'll be, oh, that's a great story. And they build up a little bit of hype and it'll get some attention and it'll be brilliant, but they're still not on the scale of mainstream media. But because mainstream media is established, their successes, even though higher in terms of money, they seem a lot smaller than new startup sites who are really shaking up debates kind of thing. So I do think it's about perspective, and that mainstream media has to find a way to begin to adapt, because I'm not sure that they've really thought about that yet or come up with any answers.
Well, that's a very fair point. Now, you talked there about the independent media sites that are really starting to shake up the political conversation. All credit to sites like Evolve Politics and The Canary. Some of their stories during the election cycle were some of the most read stories online. They were far outstripping in some cases even The Guardian, The Independent, like sites that are really, really huge online. And the problem I have with them at times is, as you said, the clickbait culture that has kind of evolved. And I've actually had this discussion sort of very briefly with people at The Canary, and they sent me this page about, what is clickbait and about how they're just trying to get their writers the most amount of money. And I totally appreciate that, because, you want people to read your stories. But I kind of feel that the clickbait outrage culture headlines that pop up everywhere online about every tiny little story, it kind of wears people out, and it leaves people in a stage of like apathy, where they don't quite know what to actually be annoyed about. And I just feel that it's really harmful for our political conversation in general. And I was wondering, do you have any sort of policy on that at Stand Up Magazine? Like, is there anything that you try and pull out of your writers to make sure that they're producing good quality journalism?
Yeah, we don't really go for the clickbait model, and we know that could financially harm us, because if we go for an outrageous headline, we're more likely to get the clicks. But we do features, and we always try and have an empowering angle if we can. So we'll try and energize people to say, if you're not happy about this, these are some ways that you can make a difference. Or here's this young person who's really trying to shake things up in politics. It can't always be like that. Sometimes there is problematic content that we will have to call out, or something's going on where we're taking editorial stance to go, this isn't okay, or we've picked up the story. But generally we do try and balance it out. We don't want it all doom and gloom. We do believe that if people want change, then we don't want to burn them out. We want them to feel some hope and to feel motivated to get on. Plus, we don't want to be able to make a profit off people's fear. We really want to be able to motivate people and to give analysis. We could do really quick stories every day that we pick up off The Guardian and get quick quotes and reactions. That's not really for us. We really want to take an issue and look at it and let people draw their own conclusions.
I applaud very much your passion for trying to find interesting stories and wanting to take your time with it, because a lot of what news is based on now anyway is just getting there first and being that first voice, that first breaking of the news story. But I think that it's important to take time to really look at something, because if there's some huge event and you're reacting to it within hours, you're never going to have the full story, and you might end up making a fool of yourself.
Yeah.
And you lose a little bit of credibility, I think, when you're just rushing to get there first. Because, again, not to slam them too much, because I do enjoy a lot of their work. The Evolve Politics and The Canary are both seen by a lot of people in the centre and on the right as just left-wing versions of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph and the Sun, because they're so heavily anti-Tory. And I'm just, at the minute, personally, I'm just trying to grapple with how you get the media to just stop with the horrendous bias and the kind of really heavy editorial stance that comes with it. Or do you think there's any way really to impact that? Or do you think there's no way to really affect that?
I think really we'll have to talk about how we consume the media, because the fact is that sites wouldn't feel under pressure to go with a clickbait model quite as much as they do if we had a culture where we were more willing to pay writers for their labour. You know, everything has gone online, and you can read a post or an article what has taken somebody a couple of hours, and you can read it in 30 seconds and never think of it again. But they've put labour in and need money from that. And the media doesn't know how to kind of draw revenue, or at least sustainable revenue. And we have seen that with, like, The Guardian, for instance, and even The Independent, where they're not quite sure of how to make a profit. Now, that's going to be incredibly difficult for news sites who may have to pay for domain names, hosting, everything else, as well as writers, and to get writers on board and build up that whole community and the audience. So it's partly about consumerism, and we have to think about how we really try and balance the two between supporting writers. And I can certainly understand the pressure that certain sites feel to be able to pay writers, because it's just horrific if you can't. But at the same time, it's as much about our own actions as journalists as it is about how we all as individuals consume media and what we expect from the media. You know, if we're not willing to pay for media, do we really expect high quality media?
Yeah, I to that point about paying writers, it's something I've actually encountered as a writer myself, having applied to quite a number of jobs to then find out that they're expecting it to be voluntary. And then there was one particular site that I'm not going to mention the name of, that have something in the range of 20 to 25,000 Twitter followers. They are currently like looking for Patreon contributors and PayPal donations. They're running a crowdfunding campaign so that they can expand. And I messaged them asking about, you know, were they hiring, you know, how I should go about applying, and, you know, what sort of remuneration could be expected. And they came back to me with just this ridiculous statement about how they don't pay any of their writers. And that, I was just baffled, because they're trying to really challenge sort of mainstream media, and yet they're not willing to even pay like a tiny bit for the work that people are putting in, because like a really good piece can take days sometimes to put together. And I feel like it's kind of an insult to the writers a little bit to not want to pay them. You mentioned twice actually there about how the mainstream media like The Guardian, The Independent are sort of not quite sure how to sustainably fund journalism. What if you were in their position? What would you do? Like, how would you go about trying to sustainably fund what they're trying to do?
I do think that ideally there should be, and that I feel that, like, if you look at the entire broad spectrum of journalism, one of the only areas which is doing quite well and quite healthy is print magazines. Now, it's very rare that you get a print product that is aspirational and that has some longevity. I feel that if there was a bit more brand extension from the major publications, and they were looking at ways to really sell themselves either as a movement or as integral journalism, it doesn't have to be a magazine, but in any way of perhaps investing young journalists and try and outsource their own skills, hold workshops, things like that, or try to get their name out there a bit more on a ground level. They looked at brand extension, if they looked at maybe more donations. I know The Guardian do have subscriber lists, etc. They need to be more diverse, basically, in how they go about their business. It's not just somebody buys a newspaper anymore, or somebody pays for an ad and then that's it, because there's a huge amount of content now that is required online, and most of that content, the ads are cheaper, so they're not getting as much revenue from that, but they need more content to go out every single day to get more of an audience. So basically the demand is higher than ever for journalism, but actually the returns are a lot lower. So they have to look at different ways to be able to derive revenue. And it might not be strictly from an article in the traditional sense. It may be through brand extension or looking a bit beyond what they're doing just online.
So you essentially think they need to restructure their way of looking at revenue generation?
I think so, yes, but I do think that media is going to be quite limited for a while because there's only so much you can do, and yes, they can set up other models to try and get revenue from that through brand extension, but at the same time, they're not generating the profits that it doesn't solve the ultimate conundrum of how to get profit from the article that appears online, and there's always going to be that kind of wall until audiences are a bit more receptive to, do we need a subscription model? Do we need to work out more for donations? Do we need to work out more for ads? Do we need to do more to promote the organisations who we are reading? Does there more have to be of a closer relationship between the audience and the organisation, for instance?
Okay, so would you say that's through sort of, like you mentioned, community engagement? Do you think that's more that they should be branching out in the forms of media that they're trying to produce, like digitally, in terms of maybe podcasting, for example, or, you know, videos or documentaries, mini docs? Like, where would you say the sort of fertile ground is at the minute?
I think definitely all of them are valid. We know that video media, I think basically that should be maybe limit that to social media engagement, etc. But I think documentaries, mini docs and etc. have not really been explored. Like, let's take a campaign, what we're interested in. If we want to look at the NHS, why don't we produce a whole film around that instead of just doing it straight print journalism and maybe blend the two? There's not really been that huge amount of exploration with that. We know that there's a few organisations, I think the Times, Guardian, Independent, I'm pretty sure the Telegraph as well, they've all got their own podcasts or are all working on them in some way, and podcasts are getting the views. I mean, I think it was Audio Time that found that people are spending about 6 hours a week listening to podcasts in the UK, which is a huge amount. But at the same time, podcasts have the same problem. People are watching, but they're not giving the money for it. So I do think media has to get used to saying, hey, why don't you donate for this content? If you like it, maybe just donate even just 50p, and that'll be enough. Like the same as what an old piece of paper, a newspaper would be.
Well, to that end, I think that there's definitely ways in which you can fund it. Like there's examples of hundreds, maybe thousands of YouTubers who fund themselves now through Patreon donations, through sponsorships of their videos or podcasts. I think that there really is a way to do it, and maybe they just need to be smarter about how they're going about it, because there's examples out there of people just doing it themselves, and they've become popular because they're producing quality content that people want to see, and it could well be a quality problem.
Yeah, I do think that is an issue, because if you look, there are sites, I mean, such as if you take The Establishment, that was, I think, almost completely crowdfunded, is on Patreon now, but they're producing articles by marginalised voices who just don't get the time whatsoever on mainstream media. So they'll look at issues such as race and transphobia and things in society which are kind of ignored. But because they're doing that and it's in a high quality way, people are willing to pay for the content because they're not getting it anywhere else, and the mainstream media has kind of let them down. So people are flocking around content they want to see. And that's why so many independent outlets are really flourishing, because they found their unique selling point. They found what the media is failing at, and they've found a way to capitalise it. And while the mainstream media is kind of looking around going, we don't know what to do, we don't know how to make money, we don't know how to keep the audience, and we don't understand why we're losing them to smaller sites.
Yeah, it honestly baffles me a little bit. And I guess it's the same as how we were talking about the Tories just not quite getting it in that. So in America, for example, right, the highest rated cable news show gets about 1 million viewers a week. And for example, Alex Jones, right, he's absolutely crazy at times. He gets InfoWars and Alex Jones like regularly average 40 million viewers a week. Like Joe Rogan, who's got one of the biggest podcasts in the world, like again regularly gets 70, 80, 90 million people every week listening and watching what he's doing. So I think that it's kind of I don't really feel sorry for them not knowing what's going on, because in my mind, to an extent, the Guardian signed their own death warrant a little bit in their vilification of Jeremy Corbyn at the start of his tenure. They just, to me, I do not understand why they failed to endorse or at least give fair coverage to a man that espoused all of the values that they claim to have and things that they argue for. I feel like they've kind of just painted themselves into a corner. And do you see there being a way back for them to reestablish themselves as the forefront of media?
I think it's always possible if they're willing to learn the lessons. I do think they took a gamble and they saw Corbyn and they thought, well, he's probably going to win the election, so why don't we be ahead of the curve and why don't we just kind of run quite negative campaigns where a left-wing publication will get credit for that if he fails, and then people will flock to us as being kind of leading the way of that and of predicting that first. But the complete opposite happened, so they got left behind. And it was kind of a gamble that just didn't pay off in terms of the editorials. And I'm not saying that they don't sincerely believe that Jeremy Corbyn is the wrong man by some of the writers and the editorials that have came out. But overall, the direction, it missed a trick when so many of Corbyn's supporters really do engage and believe in him quite a lot, so that if there was going to be quite negative coverage, it was always going to isolate those people. And therefore, if Corbyn did well, they were always going to lose those views. And there is, because of the anti-Tory sentiment around, the UK is quite split right now with the Tories and with Brexit. And it feels as though people are quite loyal to what they believe in. So the divide is almost harder to bridge than ever. In the long run, though, if the Guardian does fair editorials and is maybe a bit more sympathetic to Corbyn, will the Corbyn supporters come back? I do think so, probably, especially by the time the next general election campaign comes around, because at the end of the day, it benefits Corbyn more if people are reading a website that is fair about him. So I do think if the Guardian changes the content, it may be a long wait if Theresa May holds on and the election's a few years off. But if the Guardian can hold on in there and give fair content, then I do think people will eventually come back to them. But right now, there are a lot of people online who are just going to trash anything they say, because there's people treat politics almost as if there's loyalty from major publications. So when the Daily Mail and the Telegraph, etc., are all against Corbyn, which we expect because they're more right-leaning, when the left-wing publications kind of did not endorse Corbyn that strongly, people felt very burned and as though they were having a real fight, particularly with the Tory policies. And they do take it very personally, because politics is personal to them and it is going to define so much of their lives. And I think that's what the editorial boards, sometimes when we're writing articles, are at risk of forgetting that actually all the policies we're writing about affect real people every day.
That's actually an interesting point. I hadn't honestly considered that being the reason for the Guardian's sort of anti-Corbyn stance when he first came out as leader. Mostly I just sort of, not that I'd completely bought into it, but I just heard a lot of people shouting and screaming about how he threatened their corporate ownership and therefore they were always going to be anti-Corbyn. So you think it was more them trying to get out ahead of sites in being like, oh, this man will never survive, and then when he didn't, in their mind, that they would be praised as being, the people who really understand what's going on?
I think that's definitely a possibility. For me, just for business sense, it would make sense if they did take that gamble and did think that. But there was never going to be any real love for Corbyn anyways, because he's never been particularly media friendly in terms of one-on-one journalist interviews, etc. So, and he was getting a lot of criticism from the Labour, so it just made sense of, if this is going to be a massive story where Labour are going to fall apart and Corbyn is the reason why, or Corbyn is a failure, then let's capitalise on that. I don't know if it was a big motivator whatsoever, but it certainly would have had some benefit to them if Corbyn had failed. And it did seem for quite a long time that he would go, or that Labour would try and get rid of him, or were desperate to. So I can understand the Guardian thinking, you know what, it makes sense not to be overtly in Corbyn's camp.
That's an interesting take on it. Like I said, I hadn't really considered that, but editorially, I guess it would make sense. It's a bit of a gamble, but if things had gone the other way, it might have paid off, and they might have been seeing record readerships, I guess.
Well, it didn't look as though Corbyn was going to get anywhere for quite a long time. From his very first election, it seemed as though he was going to have everyone against him. So it's quite short-term to think, will he hang on or not?
Well, I think that short-term thinking is pretty indicative of our entire world right now. You talked there a little bit about the sort of polarization of politics and the kind of very personal aspect of it, and this sort of drive towards identity politics, in that your political beliefs are everything about you, that defines you now. There was actually a piece I saw that ironically the Guardian put out yesterday. It was just an opinion piece about should you be friends with a Tory, and I just rolled my eyes, because that is potentially like the most divisive and ridiculous headline I think I've seen, and that says something given the media climate that we live in. Why do you think that we've got to this point where politics has become so personal for people, and it seems to be just a 24/7 cycle of more outrage and more news, and honestly, I'm potentially too young to remember what it was like in the 90s or perhaps further back than that, but this feels very new to me, in that politics has just become absorbed in our daily routine. Why do you think we've got to that place?
I think it's been a really long time coming, actually. I think particularly for millennials who really want to have a voice in politics but have been ignored. There's been decisions. I mean, we've lived under austerity now since 2010. We had the financial crash long before that. There has been almost now a decade of people living with the effects of the financial strife that we had in this country, and that sows deep divisions and it sows resentment, and people who were struggling tend to go more right wing, and so we see divisions and discussions around immigration, which were quite irresponsible at times, about whether the country could take in more migrants, and there wasn't a huge lot of facts, but it was excused by some politicians because there was this argument that we needed to listen to legitimate concerns, but nobody ever really spelled out these concerns or challenged it in a robust or fair way. And UKIP won the BBC almost every other week, putting their opinions across, and at one point they would have been seen as a joke, but because they were on the TV every single week, it suddenly became normal. So all of these divisions and all this anger suddenly got normalised throughout all of the years, and it culminated with a couple of reckless decisions from politicians, we'll have to say, to even have the referendum in the first place, which was always going to be huge, and it was a very close vote. If the vote wasn't as close either side of it, there wouldn't still be this animosity. Had it have been a massive landslide for Leave or Remain, the country would have been a lot more united no matter what. And then across the Atlantic, we have Trump, who's just the most ridiculous figure ever. There has been, and across Europe as well, there's kind of not a sense of hopelessness, but there has been, surprise with Le Pen and Geert Wilders. It's almost as though, yes, we've just hung on against really far-right characters, but the divisions are still there, and what is round the corner is they're even worse. We're really quite shaken up about what is to come in the future, and that is entrenching division, because people really do feel as though they're really fighting and arguing to hear their story, for people to hear their stories, like with policies around disability. We know how badly welfare cuts have hit people, and it really is personal for people, so that it's no surprise when there is such anti-Tory attitudes, but it has been a long time in the making. It hasn't just sprung out of nowhere, I don't think.
That's interesting that you kind of attribute it as much to the economic situation as much as the media. It kind of plays into something I've been mulling over. Now, I have a very, admittedly, half-baked theory that nearly every situation where we have political discord at the minute, like really severe polarization, can be drawn back to the economic situation of the country. With Brexit, people we're still feeling the effects of the crash 6 years after the Tories claimed that they were going to fix it. That we currently have the 9 poorest places in Europe in the UK. We've got inflation going up because of Brexit. The pound is weak at the minute. We've got the housing bubble almost back to where it was at pre-crash levels. We've got poor wage growth. We've got whispers of a crash coming next month. There's just like a whole landslide of like poor economic outlook for people. And I think that a lot of the animosity is drawn out of helplessness. And I'm not sure where, again, we go from here, because to me it looks like that things are just ramping up and ramping up and ramping up. Like look at the outbreaks of violence in America. Like America's a ticking time bomb at the minute, really. And I think that we're probably reasonably, maybe not right quite there yet, but we're not really far behind in terms of the unstable social climate and sort of like if things start to go wrong, like really badly wrong, like I genuinely think we'll see like huge protests, maybe strikes, maybe riots. I don't know. It's, very speculative, obviously. But do you think that there's a remedy to the situation? Like, do you think that there's a way that we can pull people back from this really sort of antagonistic place that we're at?
I think it needs to be long-term engagement, and particularly the attitudes around Parliament have not helped. And even Labour have been guilty of this. I mean, if you take the one divisive issue in the UK in particular right now, it is Brexit. And everyone keeps talking about hard Brexit and done deals, and there's been no real attempt to reach out to Remain camp, and therefore overwhelmingly young people as well, and reassure with them about their future. Because right now, millennials in particular are just really angry because, tuition fees have gone up, and they were put up by a generation who benefited from free university. They lost AMA, overwhelmingly wanted to stay part of the EU, but the country's leaving. It feels as though almost millennials and young people are picking up the tab for all of the decisions that older generations are making. And there's a real sense of anger to that, and that we're not being listened to whatsoever. So there has to be honest conversations. That said, if that doesn't happen, I don't think the divide has to be a negative thing. If it descends into violence and there is absolute fallout from Brexit, that will be chaos and that will be awful. But at the same time, young people
can avoid that.
Hopefully, and I do think we will. But at the election, young people did turn out and want to have their say. Young people are energised and want to make a difference. So it could be the start of, from a really quite negative situation, young people being inspired to make change and hopefully in the long term engage. So maybe there is a little bit of a silver lining.
Well, I guess it's kind of playing into the night is darkest just before the dawn cliche. In that, I do agree with you that I think that as a result of the situation we're in and the kind of the way that politicians, maybe on both sides, there's just a lot of voices in the general public that aren't being heard and aren't being expressed by politicians in Westminster. And I think that because of that we're now seeing the turmoil that is caused when people don't get their voices heard. They get more and more frustrated about it. But as you say, that we could see this meaning that young people are the most engaged generation politically that we've seen in decades, that could mean that pushing forwards we might end up seeing a kind of watershed moment where the younger voice becomes the majority. I think, not to be too morbid about it, but Lord Heseltine said the other day that Tory voters are dying off at 2% a year, and that was a real concern for the party. And while that's a bit sort of, exaggerated, it's a fair point, I think, in that there is like a generation coming of age that has seen 10 years of having to deal with the economic fallout of New Labour's policies and of austerity and arguably cuts to public services that are completely unnecessary at times. That I think it's a case of prioritizing what we want to spend our money on personally, and we're sort of choosing the wrong options. But like you said, I do think that there could be that watershed moment. Do you have any thoughts on when that could be? Do you think it's the next election, or do you think it has to get worse for things to get better?
I think it's likely to start relatively soon. I would say potentially within the next year, if we don't see any real development with Brexit, or if Brexit develops and it looks like an absolute catastrophe, but we're still going to leave anyway. I think that's the crucial point, and that'll be the crucial trigger as well for when the election is called, and everything else leading up to it, as well as how Corbyn reacts to it, because he's not really put out a clear vision yet. And I think right now there's a bit of calm because everyone is sick of talking about Brexit because we don't know anything yet. But eventually down the line, it will start coming at the conversation, and people will start thinking, okay, so what is going to happen then? We've had a bit of a break. You've done your work. What have you found out from the EU? What are we going to have to pay? What are we going to be left behind with? And it's okay. And Corbyn's in a bit of honeymoon right now, and May's in a bit of a honeymoon herself because she's managed to hang on and survive. And she looks fairly comfortable right now with the DUP, not really making any waves whatsoever. But when the real business starts...
They haven't really had a vote on anything. Do you know what I mean? They haven't had to push through anything controversial. I think the strength of that coalition will be tested when it comes to trying to put actual legislation through Parliament. Because I think that there could well be, I could be wrong, but I think there could well be quite a few Tories who are very willing to kind of betray the party, and backbenchers particularly who are willing to go against the party whip. So I think that coalition is kind of untested at the minute.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to see what is going to actually happen, because there has been, it's quite a still pond at the minute where nothing's really getting done right now. But what happens when a legislative agenda is pushed forward? What happens if allies close to whoever wants to be the next Conservative leader, and I won't speculate on who, although I'm sure we can all guess. What are they going to try and sabotage the agenda? Where does the DUP play into it? There's plenty of Conservatives who are uncomfortable with being associated with the DUP. How is it really going to play going forward? And when we have so many legal changes which are going to need to be made and probably is voted on quite soon, when that is looming on the horizon, is this government just going to fall apart because everyone's fighting and nothing's getting done? And will it weaken us in terms of negotiations of what we can get out of it as a country? You know, there's a lot that could go wrong. There's a lot there where the DUP, the Tories might just think, we're not up for the fight, and if we can get through this and hang on till the next Parliament, we might have a chance at the election. But there's a huge chance it's going to fall apart. And at any instance of chaos, then I do think young people will be more likely to be energised and want to get out and have their say, because young people didn't vote for the Conservatives, young people definitely didn't vote for the DUP, and young people didn't vote for Brexit. So there's three big issues that the country is facing, what are dominating the agenda: the DUP, the Tories and Brexit. Young people didn't really vote for any of them.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. Because there's very conceivably a scenario in which we have an election called at the end of the year, but there's also very, very conceivably a scenario in which we have no election until 2022. The Fixed Term Parliament Act means that the Conservatives can't be ousted as easily as they used to be. They can't force an election just based on like a failed budget or a failed Queen's speech or anything like that. It has to be an explicit vote of no confidence now in Parliament, and then it has to be. Then they have 2 weeks in which to install a new government. So even if we get to conference season, for example, right, and Dennis Campbell of UK Progressive, actually, that we had on not just 2 weeks ago, he has a theory that Theresa May won't survive conference season. Now, that could very easily happen, and she could be ousted. There could be a vote of no confidence, and the Tories could install a new leader, reaffirm their partnership with the DUP, and get another government formed, and we'd be essentially in the same situation. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch it play out.
It always is with the Tories. You have to at least give them the great Shakespearean type dramas.
Oh yeah, well, you could say that about Trump as well.
True.
Anyway, just to sort of move us off of current events, I was keen to ask you actually how you consume your media. Like, how do you go about, finding out what's going on in the news? Because I have quite a weird media diet. It's sort of based on Reddit, and then sort of just social media, Twitter, and sort of going occasionally to sites that I enjoy. Like for American politics, it's Vox or Slate, and for the UK, it's Evolved Politics to an extent. It's New Statesman and The Guardian as well. They do still do some great reporting. But I was curious to see as what is your sort of maybe routine or your sort of program for consuming what's going on? Like, where do you turn to?
So first thing I do on a morning before anything else is check BBC and Al Jazeera just in case Trump's done anything or decided a UK new one or sent some aggressive tweets or anything like that. My diet at the minute of breaking news, it has to be mostly Twitter. Mostly just because of stand-up work, I'm on the go. I'm not, apart from first thing on the morning, I'm not ever around a TV. So if anything's happening, I'm usually travelling. So I need that to keep up to date. But there's great sites at the minute. I mean, I do like BuzzFeed for its investigative journalism. It's lists I tend to avoid, but its investigative journalism is quite good.
Well, their podcast about investigative journalism is also very good.
Yeah, it is. Guardian, Independent, Motherboard, Slate for more US type of news, but I do like quite independent sites as well, which have been set up and seek to explore kind of marginalised voices and do features such as like Bitch Media, The Establishment. There's some really great sites out there which are hearing from people who never really get a look in. Mask Magazine in New York is a really good one as well. So
I've heard of that. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
What do they do?
So they look at really kind of niche kind of features. So they'll do stuff on body positivity or queer lives, and they look at it in a very niche way that nobody else is really doing in the mainstream. It's not really about hate crimes, but about the nuances of life kind of thing, and very culture based. So it's a nice little blend. So it's quite optimistic and it's quite informative and detailed, but without any of the really negative news around it.
Well, that's got to be a bit refreshing to read something that's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah, I definitely prefer features at the minute which are a bit more analysis or hearing from people than just news of this is the latest bad thing that's happened.
Yeah, I think we can all get a bit caught up in that. Twitter, actually, I find is genuinely a pretty good resource, but I guess it really depends on who you're following before you can claim it as a solid way to consume your news. Is there any particular like social media site? Is Twitter your go-to?
Twitter is, I would recommend to anyone that they all follow the big main organisations in America and the UK, such as whether it's CNN. I know Trump's not a fan, but pretty good for breaking stories. BBC, follow a range of them, even ones you don't agree with, because if there's a breaking story, they're the ones who will get verified reports to speak to witnesses first. So if you're seeing a little bit of rumblings about a story breaking on Twitter, as soon as they've reported it, that's really going on if you can't get around. So, but also be very careful. Don't just go with unreported stories, because that is a bit of a trap, particularly if anything is breaking. We've had some horrific stories going around with terrorism, etc. And there's been fake lists of people missing, which has been really pretty horrific. So wait until you see the big publications tweet about that, just to be on the safe side.
That's fair. So you would still say that those mainstream outlets have got a very important role to play in terms of the resources they can bring to reporting more breaking stories?
Oh, definitely. They have that credibility. There is a level of trust with a site that has been around for so many years that what they're reporting is likely to be good, because we've been exposed to their stories for so many years. Even if we're not a big reader of, say, the Times, we know there is some quality just that comes with that brand name because they have been trusted and been around and are a big major outlet that's consumed by the public. So they do still have a role to play, particularly with breaking news, because there are so many unverified stories happening on Twitter that get blown up, but then all of a sudden the news outlets will be, actually, this isn't what happened, this is really what's going on, and it's not being reported accurately. So they definitely do have a big role to play, particularly just because it's not really, I don't really see it as an era of massive fake news, but an era of where everyone can say anything is news. So, everyone on social media all of a sudden is in a position where they get to sell their little tweet, which is basically a story, but they're not trained as journalists. It might not be happening. It might not be happening in the right way, kind of thing. So you still need the big sites to be able to really do that analysis and get their journalists out there pretty quickly.
Okay, well, that's definitely a nice perspective to take on it. I really do agree with you in terms of how much impact mainstream media still has. I've had numerous arguments with people claiming they're dead, and you see in America especially sort of the word fake news, anything CNN or even the New York Times, who are pretty solid on their investigative reporting, are putting out. It does make me laugh, but it's also quite horrifying at times as well. But just to kind of finish off, I wanted to ask you where Stand Up Mag is going next. Do you have plans to expand? Is there anything you're working on that you're going to put out that you can reveal to us secretly?
Yeah, we do actually have quite a lot coming up. You're actually one of the first to know is that we have a special superhero series lined up where we're looking at really the impact of comic books on culture and how it relates to politics, because a lot of their stories are inherently political. This is going to be online content, and once that is finished, and that's like a little special gift just for fans and supporters of the site, we are launching issue 2, which is going to be a reflection of the general election, look at how young people can engage in politics. Also got some great features coming up about the young people across Europe who were volunteering to support refugees amid the crisis, while politicians are really kind of dragging their feet on that. We also have a nice feature on the rise of podcasts and how they've really taken off in popularity, which is quite fitting. As well as looking at like projects such as I'm Tired, which is a wonderful photographic organisation who take photographs of people who are telling their stories on different microaggressions they've experienced, whether it be racism, sexism. So we're looking at different...
I hate that word so much. Microaggression is I understand where people are coming from, but it's partially responsible for destroying our political conversation, I think.
Read that article. Maybe we can change your mind on that.
I'm happy to give it a listen, but the word microaggression I feel that it just gets misused so much that it just needs to be not banned, obviously, but people need to seriously consider when they're going to use the term, because generally people are not attempting to offend you.
I do think, this comes back again to responsible reporting and how we really enter discussions, and to make sure that we are very clear in the words that we're using and that it's to an appropriate context. Microaggressions don't always have to need to offend, for example, but it's about inherent prejudices, what we may not realise. At the same time, we should be able to have a discussion that says, look, this could be something that's an issue going on, this could be a microaggression, but that isn't necessarily negative or targeting someone. It's just saying, could we have a conversation around this? Could we really explore what's going on? And I feel that's being lost from journalism, instead of it really being an open dialogue and an open conversation to really explore all different possibilities of avenues. People are much more in their own kind of camps, and, you get the alt-right really screaming at people, etc. And we're not really having discussions.
If you want to learn about the alt-right, there's a fantastic video by Rebel Media and this guy Gavin McGuinness, and he breaks down all the different sections of the right wing and the alt-right, and he does a fantastic job of separating the sort of Pepe meme generating people from the like scary white supremacists, and really breaks it down. Actually, it's a really great video.
Yeah, because there's a huge amount of factions within the movement which allowed it to kind of build up. And a lot of them actually completely disagree with each other on so many points. And there's a lot of infighting and don't want to be associated with it. It's like the BNP and UKIP, but they're really part of the same right-wing ideology, but they would not want to be associated with each other whatsoever.
No, it's kind of a fracturing, I think, that's going on both sides. And eventually I think we'll probably see maybe more parties being thrust to the fore, but I guess that's not going to really happen until we get PR or AV or something along those lines.
Yeah, which doesn't seem to be coming anytime soon.
No, I think David Cameron killed the referendum with one TV appearance. He went on and he just said, well, no one really understands it. And I felt like slapping him because I was like, prick, you know exactly what it means, and that's why you're saying this.
I mean, he's not been very helpful for any referendum going, really.
No, he hasn't. Oh well, hopefully we can see a bit of a positive forward movement on independent media and our political conversation in the future.
I think definitely. I think it's more a case of mainstream media restructuring while independent media continues to rise.
Yeah, well, I think that's a nice note to finish it on. Thanks very much for appearing on the show.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to speak to you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to share us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, text message, Telegram, whatever you prefer. Carrier pigeon, although it's probably inefficient, but go for it. Later in the week, we've got interviews with Sam Ancliffe from Activate Britain and Elizabeth Voss of Disobedient Media. So tune in later in the week if you want to hear those. Until next time, thank you.